Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. In the farthest reaches of the East, where the maps of the Free Peoples grow pale and uncertain, where the ink fades into speculation and rumor, there exists a silence that is not empty but full, heavy with untold histories, with names that were spoken once and then forbidden, with deeds recorded only in the memory of stones and wind. Among those lost names, one echoes faintly still, carried on desert winds that sweep across dunes no Western scholar has ever charted. Khamûl. Not the Witch King, whose terror froze the blood of Gondor's mightiest warriors. Not Gothmog or the nameless others whose cruelty is sung in lament. But the second, the Black Easterling, the dark marshal of Dol Guldur, the shadow lieutenant whose very existence the histories of the West barely acknowledge. Why? Perhaps because his origins lie beyond the borders of recorded lore. Perhaps because his deeds were done in lands where no elvish chronicler dwelt, no Dunedain scribe kept watch. Or perhaps because to speak his name is to invoke something the Free Peoples would rather forget. That evil does not arise only in the West, that corruption knows no border, and that the Ring's seduction reached even into realms untouched by the wars of elves and men. The wind carries his name still. Khamûl. Second of the nine, the most sensitive to the One Ring's presence, yet the most vulnerable to light. A paradox wrapped in shadow, a mystery folded into the greater darkness of Sauron's design. This is his story, or what fragments of it remain, pieced together from the margins of ancient texts, from implications and inferences, from the few moments when his presence is noted but never fully explained. It is a tale of ambition and dissolution, of a man who reached for power and found instead that power reached through him, hollowing him out until only hunger remained. Listen closely. The wind is speaking, and it remembers what the histories forgot. Beyond the misty mountains, beyond even the great forests of Mirkwood and the plains of Rivanion, there stretches a land that exists in Western consciousness only as a threat, a direction from which darkness comes. Rhûn the East. What do we know of it? Precious little. Tolkien himself left it shrouded, a realm of suggestion rather than detail. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and in that silence, we can perceive outlines, the shape of cultures older than Númenor, civilizations that rose and fell while the elves still dwelt in Beleriand. The Easterlings were not a single people, but many, tribes and kingdoms, nomadic horsemen and settled city builders, priests of forgotten gods and warlords who carved empires from stone and blood. They built temples whose foundations still stand, though their names are lost. They wove tapestries depicting stars that no longer shine. They sang songs in languages that have no descendants, and they were proud. In that pride lay both their greatness and their vulnerability, for pride is the crack through which corruption seeps, the gateway through which the shadow enters. Morgoth knew this in the elder days. Sauron, his greatest pupil, learned the lesson well. In the late Second Age, when Sauron walked Middle-earth in fair form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, he did not restrict his attention to the elves of a region. While Celebrimbor and his smiths labored over their rings of power, Sauron's emissaries traveled east, bearing different gifts, speaking different promises. To the Easterlings, they spoke of dominion, of strength to resist the growing power of Númenor, whose ships had begun appearing on eastern shores, whose colonies pressed into territories the Easterlings considered their own. Of glory that would not bow to Western kings. Of rings that would grant their bearers the authority to unite the scattered tribes, to build empires that would endure when Númenor itself was dust. 9 rings were made for mortal men. 3 went to Númenorian lords, those who would become the most terrible of the Nazgûl, including the Witch King himself. The others went east and south, to kings and chieftains whose names the West never learned, whose kingdoms are unmarked on any map that survives. Khamûl was one of these. We do not know his original name. That knowledge perished with him, or perhaps was consumed by the ring that devoured his identity. We do not know precisely where he ruled, though the title Easterling suggests the lands of Rhûn, perhaps along the great inland sea, or in the vast steppes where horses ran wild and cities rose like mirages from the desert. But we can imagine him, a chieftain or king, a man of considerable power even before the ring found him. A warrior, certainly. The Nazgûl were not chosen from the weak or cowardly. A leader who commanded loyalty, who held authority over men who were themselves fierce and unyielding. Perhaps a conqueror, one who had already tasted victory and found it intoxicating. Into his hands came a gift wrapped in silver and promises, a ring of power. And with it came whispers that would never, ever stop. At first, the ring seemed everything it promised to be. Imagine Khamûl, still mortal, still himself, sliding the ring onto his finger for the first time. The sensation would have been unlike anything he had known. A sudden clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from the world. Colors became more vivid, sounds more distinct. He could hear conversations from rooms away, could see the truth behind men's smiles, could sense the fear and loyalty and hatred that swirled invisible around him. His commands carried new weight. When he spoke, men listened with an intensity that bordered on reverence. His presence filled rooms, demanded attention, inspired awe and terror in equal measure. Rivals who had questioned his authority fell silent. Enemies who had resisted his rule found their courage evaporating like morning mist. The ring amplified what was already there, his ambition, his will, his desire for control. But it did so selectively, like a breeder cultivating certain traits in livestock, encouraging some aspects of his character while letting others atrophy. Compassion faded first, not suddenly, but gradually, so gradually that Khamûl might not have noticed. Small mercies became inconveniences. Forgiveness seemed weakness. The suffering of others lost its power to move him, becoming instead mere information, useful only insofar as it could be exploited. Then came the physical changes. Subtle at first, a sensitivity to bright sunlight that made him squint and prefer the shade. A creeping chill in his bones that no fire could quite banish. Food began to taste like ash. Sleep brought dreams of shadow, of a great eye that watched and waited, of a voice that spoke his true name. The name beneath the name, the secret syllables that defined his essence. He found himself reaching for the ring more frequently. At first, he had worn it only in moments of need, when he required its power. But increasingly, he wore it simply to feel normal, to reclaim the clarity and strength that seemed to drain away in its absence. Without it, the world felt dim, distant, as if he were experiencing life through thick glass. The ring was no longer a tool he used. It was using him. His reflection began to change. Not dramatically, there were no sudden horrors, no monstrous transformations. But year by year, his face grew more angular, more severe. His eyes, once bright with ambition and intelligence, became flat, lightless. His skin took on a pallor, as if the sun no longer reached it no matter how long he stood in its rays. And then one day, he looked into a polished bronze mirror and saw that his face was fading, becoming translucent, insubstantial, as if he were slowly being erased from the world of light and color and drawn into another realm entirely, the Wraith world. From the inside, the transformation did not feel like corruption. It felt like clarity. The physical world, with its limitations and frailties, seemed increasingly irrelevant. What mattered was will, was power, was the unseen currents of domination and control that flowed beneath the surface of material reality. He could sense these currents now, could feel the fear radiating from his subjects like heat from a fire, could taste the loyalty of his lieutenants, distinguish between those bound by genuine devotion and those held only by terror, could reach out with his mind and touch the edges of other consciousnesses, pressing against them, shaping their thoughts as a potter shapes clay. But there was a price. He could no longer remember the warmth of sunlight on his skin, could not recall the taste of wine or bread. The faces of those he had loved, if he had ever loved, were fading from memory, becoming anonymous, interchangeable. His own past was dissolving, fragmenting into disconnected images that might have belonged to someone else entirely. His name, his true, original name, slipped away like water through grasping fingers. He was becoming something else, something less than he had been, yet also something more focused, more potent, more terrible. He was becoming Khamûl, and Khamûl was becoming one of the Nine. They came from different lands, the ring bearers, from Númenor's proud towers, from southern kingdoms where the sun burned hot and cruel, from the east, from steppes and deserts and mountains whose names would never be recorded in Western tongues. 9 men who had been kings, sorcerers, warriors, lords. 9 who had accepted gifts that could not be refused. 9 who had worn rings that wore them in return, hollowing them out and filling the empty spaces with a will that was not their own. Sauron gathered them in the darkness of Mordor, in chambers beneath Barad-dûr that had never known light. There, the transformation was completed, not gradually this time, but in a single, terrible ritual that bound them irrevocably to the One Ring, and through it, to their master. Imagine it, 9 figures kneeling in a circle, their forms already ghostly, flickering between visibility and invisibility. Above them, Sauron stood, not in his fair form now, but in his true shape, a towering presence of malice and will. And on his finger, the One Ring burned with a light that was not light. That was instead the absence of light made visible, a radiance of shadow. He spoke their names, not the names they had been born with, nor even the titles they had claimed in life, but their secret names, the words that defined their essential nature, the syllables that contained their being like vessels contain water. To speak these names was to have total knowledge of them, total power over them. One by one, they answered. Their voices were no longer human, had not been human for years, perhaps decades. They were wind through empty halls, the creak of frozen branches, the whisper of sand across stone. And as each answered, the binding was sealed. They passed fully into the Wraith world, leaving behind the last vestiges of mortality. Their bodies did not die. That would have been a mercy. Instead, they became sustained, held in existence by the will of the ring, unable to die yet unable to truly live. They were the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the Nine, and among them, Khamûl emerged as second only to the Witch King in power and authority. Why him? Why did the Black Easterling rise above the others, above Númenorian lords who had commanded fleets, above southern kings who had ruled vast empires? perhaps because his will was particularly strong, particularly unyielding. Perhaps because the ring had found in him a peculiarly suitable vessel, a consciousness that could be shaped to serve Sauron's purposes with unusual efficiency. Or perhaps simply because chance and circumstance elevated him, and in the hierarchy of darkness, position once established tends to reinforce itself. Whatever the reason, Khamûl became the Shadow Lieutenant, the second blade in Sauron's arsenal. Where the Witch King commanded armies and broke kingdoms, Khamûl operated with subtler precision, hunting, tracking, sensing what others could not. For he had developed a unique capacity among the Nine, an extraordinary sensitivity to the presence of the rings of power, and especially to the One Ring itself. He could sense them across vast distances, could feel their signature like a bloodhound catching a scent on the wind. But this gift came with a curse. The same sensitivity that made him Sauron's greatest hunter also made him vulnerable. Sunlight, which merely weakened the other Nazgûl, was agony to Khamûl. In daylight, his power diminished drastically. His senses, so acute in darkness, became confused and uncertain. He became hesitant, vulnerable, almost pitiful. He was most powerful in shadow and most helpless in light, a creature of extremes, effective beyond measure in his element, crippled outside it. This paradox would define him throughout the ages to come. The Second Age was the age of Sauron's first dominion, when his power waxed great and terrible, when he forged the One Ring and brought much of Middle-earth under his shadow. The Nazgûl were his greatest servants, his instruments of terror and conquest. They led armies, commanded fortresses, spread fear like a plague across the lands. Khamûl returned to the east, not as the chieftain he had been, but as something far more terrible, an emissary of darkness, a shadow given form and purpose. The lands that had been his domain became Sauron's domain. The peoples who had followed him now followed in terror, for he was no longer their king but their tormentor, their doom. He did not conquer alone. The armies of Mordor moved east and south in those years, subjugating kingdoms that had thought themselves beyond Sauron's reach. But Khamûl was often at their forefront, his presence alone sufficient to break the will of defenders. Cities that had stood for centuries fell to him. Not always through siege or storm, sometimes merely through the creeping dread that preceded his arrival, the knowledge that resistance was futile, that the shadow could not be fought. Those who opposed him learned the meaning of terror. He did not kill quickly. Death in his hands became an art form, not out of sadistic pleasure, for he was long past such mortal emotions, but out of cold pragmatism. Terror was a weapon, and he wielded it with the precision of a master craftsman. Stories spread, of warriors who took their own lives rather than face him, of kings who opened their gates and surrendered their crowns without a blade being drawn, of entire populations fleeing at mere rumors of his approach. The dwarves, stubborn and resistant to domination, proved more difficult. Their minds could not be controlled as easily as men's, and their kingdoms, delved deep into mountain stone, were hard to assault. But even they learned to fear the Easterling. Dwarven holds in the eastern ranges were abandoned, their people fleeing west, rather than face the patient, inevitable siege that Khamûl brought. For decades, for centuries, this continued. The Second Age was long, over 3,000 years, and for much of it, the Nazgûl were the instruments of Sauron's will, extending his reach into every corner of Middle-earth. But pride comes before the fall, and Sauron's pride was vast beyond measure. When Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, last and mightiest of Númenor's kings, came to Middle-earth with an army so vast that Sauron's own forces deserted at the sight of it. The Dark Lord chose submission over battle. He went to Númenor as a prisoner, but in truth, as a corrupter, a subtle poison that would destroy the great kingdom from within. The Nazgûl remained in Middle-earth, and for a time their purpose was uncertain. But they did not rest. They maintained Sauron's territories, upheld his dominion, waited for his return. When Númenor fell, dragged beneath the waves by the wrath of the Valar, Sauron returned, diminished, no longer able to take fair form, but still powerful, still terrible. He rebuilt his strength, and when he was ready, he went to war against the last alliance of elves and men. The Nazgûl rode with him to that war, and Khamûl stood upon the battlefield of Dagorlad, where the armies of the West made their final stand against the darkness. He saw Gil-galad, High King of the Elves, whose brightness even the Wraith world could not dim. He saw Elendil, heir of Númenor's glory, wielding the sword Narsil. He saw the host of the Alliance, a tide of steel and courage that would not break. The battle raged for years. The dead piled so high that the marshes before Mordor's gates became choked with corpses, creating the dead marshes that would still hold their bodies millennia later. And then, at the last, Sauron emerged from Barad-dûr, and the mightiest warriors of the Alliance confronted him directly. Gil-galad and Elendil together brought down the Dark Lord, though it cost them their lives. Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, and in that instant, the Nazgûl, bound utterly to the ring, were unmade. Not destroyed, for they could not die while the ring endured. But their power was shattered, their forms dispersed. They became less than shadows, wisps of malice without shape or strength, unable to act, unable even to maintain coherent thought. They drifted. For 1,000 years and more, the Nazgûl drifted in that terrible limbo, aware, in some dim fashion, of their continued existence, but unable to influence the world, unable to do anything but endure. Khamûl, who had been second among the nine, who had commanded armies and broken kingdoms, was reduced to a whisper in the dark, a fragment of hatred with no target, no purpose, no relief. The silence of those years is beyond imagining. The Third Age dawned, and still the Nazgûl drifted, formless and impotent. But darkness is patient. Evil does not surrender merely because it has been defeated, and the One Ring had not been destroyed. Slowly, so slowly that centuries passed between each small increment, the Nazgûl began to cohere. Drawn by the continued existence of the ring, anchored by their binding to it, they pulled themselves back from the edge of dissolution. They could not yet take physical form. They could not act directly upon the world. But they could maintain some fragment of consciousness, of will. And as the centuries passed, that fragment grew. Sauron, too, was slowly rebuilding. His spirit, like those of the Nazgûl, had survived Isildur's victory. Over long ages, he gathered his strength, first as a nameless malice, then as a shadow gaining substance, and finally as a power establishing dominion once more. He hid himself in Mirkwood, in the fortress of Dol Guldur, calling himself only the Necromancer, concealing his true identity even from the wise. There he worked in secret, breeding orcs, spreading corruption, slowly and patiently reconstructing his power. And when he was strong enough, he called the Nine. They came. How could they not? They were bound to him, to the ring, with chains that could never be broken. From the corners of Middle-earth where they had drifted, formless and forgotten, they coalesced, drawn by his will like iron filings to a lodestone. In Dol Guldur, Sauron clothed them in darkness, gave them form once more, not bodies of flesh, but shapes maintained by will and malice, robes filled with emptiness, crowns placed upon heads that were not there. The Nazgûl rode again. And Khamûl, the Black Easterling, became the Dark Marshal of Dol Guldur, second in command of that fortress of shadow, the Shadow Lieutenant restored to his terrible authority. Dol Guldur was a place of slow corruption, of insidious decay. The forest around it, once part of Greenwood the Great, most beautiful of woodlands, began to darken. Trees that had stood for millennia withered. The undergrowth became tangled and hostile. Poisonous things bred in the shadows. The very air grew thick and hard to breathe. From Dol Guldur, the Nazgûl emerged periodically, hunting for the ring. For Sauron knew it had survived, knew it was somewhere in Middle-earth, but he did not know where. The Nazgûl ranged far, following rumors and whispers, seeking any hint of the One Ring's presence. Khamûl was particularly suited to this task. His sensitivity, his ability to detect the ring's aura, made him Sauron's most effective hunter. In darkness, with his full powers active, he could sense the ring from leagues away, could feel its signature like a note of music cutting through silence. But the ring was not found. It had passed into legend, into rumor, into myth. Most believed it lost forever, drowned in the Anduin or buried in some forgotten grave. The Nazgûl searched in vain. Until one day, in the shadows of Dol Guldur, Khamûl felt something, a disturbance, a presence of power that should not be there. A wizard had come to the fortress. Gandalf the Grey had long suspected that the necromancer was more than he seemed. Against the advice of others, he entered Dol Guldur to investigate, to pierce the lies and discover the truth. Khamûl sensed him immediately. Through stone and shadow, through the mists and glamours that Sauron had placed to confuse intruders, the Black Easterling felt the wizard's presence, sharp, clear, a light that could not be hidden. He reported to his master. Sauron, still not ready to reveal himself fully, chose to flee rather than confront Gandalf directly. The necromancer abandoned Dol Guldur, removing to Mordor, to Barad-dûr, which he began to rebuild. And the Nine went with him. But their time of hiding was ending. Events were in motion that would bring the One Ring back into the light, back into play. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. And Khamûl, the second greatest of the Nazgûl, would ride at its forefront, pursuing the ring to the very borders of innocence itself. The Shire had never known darkness. For over 1,000 years, hobbits had dwelt there in peace, untouched by the wars and terrors that shook the rest of Middle-earth. They knew nothing of Nazgûl or rings of power. Their concerns were gardens and meals, pipeweed and parties, genealogies and property disputes. Into this innocence came a shadow. Sauron had learned, through torment and torture, through interrogation of the wretched creature Gollum, that the ring had been found, that it was in the possession of a hobbit, that it was in the Shire. He sent the Nine to retrieve it. Khamûl led the hunt. The Nazgûl had been given new steeds, horses bred in darkness, trained to endure their masters, terrible presence, black and enormous and swift. On these fell beasts, the Nine rode north and west, crossing rivers and mountains, drawing ever closer to the quiet land where the ring waited. As they traveled, their presence corrupted the lands they passed through. Crops withered. Animals fled or fell sick. People reported nightmares, feelings of dread, a sense of being watched by invisible eyes. The Nazgûl reached the borders of the Shire in early autumn, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, when the harvest was coming in and hobbits were preparing for the season of plenty. Khamûl entered first, alone, searching. His sensitivity was both blessing and curse now. He could feel the ring, could sense its presence somewhere in this ridiculous, rustic land. But the sensation was diffuse, uncertain. The ring was here, yes, but where? And the daylight weakened him, confused his senses, made precision impossible. He rode through the Shire's lanes at dusk, when the sun's power was fading but not gone, searching, questioning, terrifying the few hobbits unlucky enough to encounter him. He came to Hobbiton, to Bag End, the home of Bilbo Baggins. He sensed something there, a resonance, a faint echo of the ring's power lingering in the very stones of the place. But when he dismounted, when he approached the door, he found the house dark, empty. He was too late. The ring-bearer had fled. Rage and frustration would have consumed a mortal hunter. But Khamûl was long past such emotions. He felt only a cold determination, a patient inevitability. The ring was near. The hunt would continue. He summoned the others, and the 9 rode together now, following the trail east. Through the old forest to Bree, where they learned the ring-bearer had been seen. Through the wilderness toward Weathertop. And at Weathertop they found their prey. 4 hobbits huddled around a fire on that ancient watchtower. And one of them, small, terrified, utterly insignificant by all physical measures, carried the one ring. The Nazgûl attacked. 5 of them came to the summit, Khamûl among them. The Witch King, greatest of the 9, led the assault. And in that confrontation, the ring-bearer did what no one expected. He put on the ring. Instantly, he passed into the Wraith world, becoming visible to the Nazgûl in a way he had not been before. And Khamûl felt it, felt the ring's presence like a blaze of light in darkness, overwhelming his senses, confirming beyond all doubt that this was indeed the one. The Witch King struck, stabbing the hobbit with a Morgul blade, a weapon designed to turn its victim into a wraith like themselves. But they did not secure the ring. The hobbit's companions drove them back, and in the confusion, the ring-bearer escaped. The hunt continued, growing more desperate. Across the ford of Bruinen, where the Witch King himself was swept away by a flood conjured by elven magic. The 9 were scattered, their horses destroyed, and for a time they were reduced once more to shadows, forced to return to Mordor on foot, diminished and defeated. Sauron did not punish them. What punishment could affect beings already damned? But he reassigned them. The Witch King went to Minas Morgul to lead the assault on Gondor. The others scattered to various tasks. And Khamûl, he returned to the east. There, he rallied armies, drew the Easterlings once more into Sauron's service, preparing them for the final war. He knew the lands, knew the peoples, knew how to inspire fear and obedience. Under his command, vast forces assembled, ready to march west when the call came. When the War of the Ring began in earnest, Khamûl led armies to assault the free peoples from the east, coordinating with the Witch King's assault on Gondor, crushing resistance, bringing Sauron's dominion ever closer to totality. But events were moving beyond his control, beyond anyone's control except perhaps the small, desperate handful who carried the ring toward Mount Doom. The sky above Mordor burned. Mount Doom, which had smoked and grumbled for years, now raged with volcanic fury. Lava flows carved new rivers of fire down its slopes. Ash clouds billowed into the sky, blotting out sun and stars. And the Nazgûl, all 9 of them reunited, flew above it on their fell beasts, winged creatures of shadow and malice, bred in darkness to serve as their steeds. They circled the mountain, drawn by the proximity of the ring. For it was there now, at the very threshold of the Samath Nor, the chambers of fire where the ring had been forged. Khamûl felt it with overwhelming intensity. The ring's presence was a scream in his senses, a light so bright it was painful even to his wraith perception. It was right there, so close, almost within reach. If they could seize it now, if they could take it from the ring-bearer and bring it to Sauron, the victory would be complete. The free peoples would be crushed. Darkness would reign eternal. The nine dove toward the mountain, but they were too late. On the ledge above the fires, a struggle took place. Brief, desperate, terrible. Gollum, that wretched creature who had borne the ring for centuries, bit the ring from Frodo Baggins's finger and fell, dancing in mad triumph, into the fires. The One Ring unmade itself in the flames where it had been forged. And the nine, bound utterly to that ring, were unmade with it. Imagine that moment from Khamûl's perspective, if perspective is even the right word for a consciousness as alien as his had become. First, a sensation of wrongness, of fundamental impossibility, as if the laws of reality themselves were inverting. Then, dissolution. Not death. Death would have been a mercy, an ending, a rest. But unmaking, the reversal of existence, the unweaving of the cords that held him together. His form, maintained by will and the power of the ring, simply ceased. The darkness that had clothed him dispersed. The malice that had animated him scattered like smoke in a high wind. For one terrible instant, he might have felt something like his original self, the mortal man he had been millennia ago, before the ring had found him. A flash of memory, of identity, of being rather than merely existing as an instrument of evil. And then nothing. The Nazgûl left no bodies, no bones, no graves. They simply ceased to be, as if they had never existed at all. The sky cleared. The fell beasts that had borne them plummeted, lifeless, into the fires below. And in the sudden silence that followed the ring's destruction, Middle-earth took its first free breath in millennia. The shadow was lifted. In the years that followed, the free peoples rebuilt. The age of men began. The elves dwindled, many sailing west to Valinor, leaving Middle-earth to its new masters. And the Nazgûl were forgotten. Not entirely, of course. Scholars knew of them. The Witch King's deeds at Fornost and Minas Tirith were recorded in detail. The attack on Frodo at Weathertop became part of the tale of the ring. But the others? The nameless Nazgûl, the servants who had done Sauron's will in shadow, who had broken kingdoms and spread terror for millennia. They faded into footnotes, into marginal references, into the category of, and also there were 8 others. Khamûl, second greatest of the 9, the Black Easterling, the Dark Marshal of Dol Guldur. His name survived only in the most obscure texts, referenced once or twice in Tolkien's writings, barely developed as a character, more concept than person. Why this obscurity? Perhaps because his greatest deeds were done in lands the West never chronicled. Perhaps because his role, while crucial, was always secondary, the lieutenant rather than the lord, the hunter rather than the master. Or perhaps because there is something fitting about his anonymity. The Nazgûl were, after all, beings who had surrendered their identities in exchange for power. They had traded names for dominion, individuality for strength. That Khamûl's name is barely remembered, that his deeds are largely unknown, is in a sense the final irony of his existence. He gained power at the cost of everything that made him himself, and in the end, even the power was stripped away, leaving not even the dignity of a well-recorded death. What remains? Only questions, only silences. Was there ever a moment in all those millennia when some fragment of his original self looked out through the wraith's empty eyes and recognized what he had become? Did he ever regret? Did he ever mourn the man he had been? We cannot know. The texts are silent. Tolkien gives us no interiority for the Nazgûl, no glimpses into their consciousness. They are opaque, unknowable, as much forces of nature as characters. But in that silence, we can perhaps hear an echo of tragedy. Not the grand tragedy of heroes who fall from grace, but the quiet tragedy of beings who hollowed themselves out in pursuit of power, who traded everything for strength, and found in the end that they had gained nothing worth keeping. Khamûl was a man once. He had a name, a history, probably loved ones, certainly ambitions and dreams. He might have been a great king in his own right, remembered with honor by his people, his name passed down through generations. Instead, he accepted a ring, and the ring took everything. Slowly, inexorably, it consumed him, his compassion, his identity, his very selfhood, until nothing remained but hunger and obedience. He became powerful, yes, second only to the Witch King among the Nine. A terror to kingdoms, a hunter of legendary skill, a commander of armies, but he ceased to be himself. Whatever name he had been born with was lost. Whatever dreams he had once cherished were forgotten. He became an instrument, a tool, a weapon wielded by a greater evil. And when that evil fell, he did not even have the dignity of an ending. He was simply erased as if he had never been. On quiet nights in the lands that were once Rune, when the wind sweeps across forgotten dunes and ancient ruins, some say you can still hear echoes. Not voices, exactly. Nothing so coherent as words, but a presence, a sense of something that was and is no more, a shadow that even the light of the Fourth Age cannot entirely dispel. The locals have stories, fragmented, contradictory, probably more folklore than history. They speak of a king who made a bargain he should not have made, of a ring that gave power but demanded everything in return, of a shadow that rode east in the last days of the world, rallying armies for a war that ended in fire and ash. They do not know Khamûl's name. Perhaps they never did. But they remember that something came from their lands, something that became part of the great darkness, something that served the enemy and was destroyed with him. Is there a lesson in Khamûl's tale? A warning? Perhaps this: that power offered freely is rarely free. That gifts that seem too good to be true invariably are. That the price of dominion is often the very self that sought dominion in the first place. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler, darker. That evil does not require monstrous beginnings. That ordinary ambition, unchecked, can lead to extraordinary corruption. That the distance between a king seeking to protect his people and a wraith serving the Dark Lord is shorter than we would like to believe. Khamûl was not born evil. The Nazgûl were not demons summoned from some hell dimension. They were men, mortal, fallible, ambitious men who made choices, who accepted gifts, who walked step by step down a path that led to damnation. At what point could they have turned back? When the ring first whispered to them? When the physical changes began? When they felt their humanity slipping away? Or was it inevitable from the moment they first touched the ring? From the instant they accepted Sauron's gift? Were they doomed from the beginning, or did they have chances? Moments when they could have cast the ring away, rejected its power, chosen their own souls over dominion. We do not know. We cannot know. What we know is the ending, that they were unmade, that they left nothing behind but fear and shadow, that their names, even the few names that survived, are spoken with dread if spoken at all. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the anonymity, the forgetting, is its own kind of justice. They sought to make themselves great, and instead they were erased. They sought to be remembered forever, and instead they are barely remembered at all. The wind carries whispers still, across the eastern lands, across the dunes and ruins and forgotten places. But the whispers grow fainter with each passing year, each turning of the seasons. Soon, perhaps already, they will fade entirely. And the name Khamûl, that once commanded armies and broke kingdoms, that rode at the forefront of darkness and spread terror across half of Middle-earth, will mean nothing at all. The shadow has passed. The world has moved on. And in the moving on, in the forgetting, there is perhaps a final victory, not over the Nazgûl, who were already defeated, but over the very idea that power and domination are worth the price they demand. Khamûl's story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper, and then with silence. And in that silence, the world begins again. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.